Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
How you doing, mate?
Yeah, I'm not bad. Not bad. How are you?
Good, and welcome all to a chapter of my life with historian and author Wayne Barton. Today we're going to be talking about Wayne's new book, Pure Genius, about a pure genius, George Best. But before we get into that, Wayne, let's talk about your background and your back catalogue.
Yeah, where do you want to start?
I want you to start at the beginning because I've seen a lot of stuff from you. You've written so many great things, and you also do a podcast with a journalist legend, Paddy Barclay, as well.
Yeah. So my first book was published in 2012. I was lucky enough to work with Brian Greenough, the former United defender. And from there, really, my opportunities for writing books sort of opened many doors from that moment, because working with Brian, I got in touch with Gordon Hill. I was obviously in touch with Tommy Docherty because Tommy did the foreword for that book. And so I've had sort of like those opportunities sort of came along like that. And then I was able to sort of write a couple of books under my own name, because publishers were interested in what I had to say. And yeah, it just sort of moved from there. And in the last few years, I felt like it's been like a thing that I've been building up, really. Earlier on, I didn't really want to take on too many big, massive projects. For example, most recently, I've written about Eric Cantona and David Beckham and as you say, George. And I felt earlier on that, maybe I wouldn't have, not so much experience because I'm a United fan, but the right context to tell the different stories and to bring something new to the table. I know people can write more than one book, but generally when you write a biography on someone, you get one chance to do it properly. And so my sort of thinking has always been to try and do it justice when you get that chance. So it's basically been sort of working along to get to this point, really, and I feel like I can do those stories justice. And most of the time, I still need to be convinced. It was one of my best friends who told me that the time, because I'd always want, I meant like any United fan who writes anything, I'd like to write books on everything to do with the club's history. So, so it was one of my friends who actually said to me, "You should write that book on George now." And I did. And yeah, that's where we are. Basically, it's been a bit of a journey and a proper indulgence because I am a fan. And being able to talk to former players and managers of my club is just a dream, really.
It certainly is. So how long ago did your pal say, write that book about George? How long has it taken you to write this masterpiece? And it's a big book. It's got a lot of pages, and it's his entire career. And does it focus on just George, the playing side of George, or does it look at the other side of George Best? Because there's many facets to the greatest footballer that's ever walked on these British Isles, George Best.
Yeah, good question. In terms of how long it's taken, like I said, I've been interviewing people for years. So whenever I do interviews, if it's with a big figure, I try and get as much information as I can. I interview them about different things. So I've got interviews with Brian, who's since passed, and Harry Gregg, who's since passed. I talked to them about George, and they had some great stories. With the thought that one day I'm going to write a book on George.
Yeah.
So it might have been maybe a couple of years ago now. My friend said to me, you should finally get this together, and start writing that book properly. And yeah, it just sort of happened like that. And then when I pitched it to my publisher, he just sort of said, well, it's his 75th birthday, so let's push it out for that. You know, this year obviously it's his 75th birthday. So yeah, that's how, you know, everything takes a long time. When it's something that's this big, you know, the stories don't appear overnight. I've had one of the stories in the book is one of the biggest stories in United history, and I've had that for maybe 4 or 5 years. And you know, when you've got a story like that that's never been told before, you have a temptation to sort of like run out and tell people it, or use it at the right time when it will have the biggest impact. And so that's what I decided to do. I knew I was going to save it for a book on George. I just didn't know when that book was going to come. It is one, that's the second part of that is, when could I have added something to the library of many books about George that would be different? And with this one, it was basically just a case of, well, the thing that I could do that's different is a book about George, the footballer. I mean, there are some great books about him, and obviously very entertaining stories of things that aren't necessarily to do with football. But there was just a gap there. If you look at it for this way, for example, there's a book on his time at Hibernian in Scotland, a full book on his time there. So there's obviously like a plethora of stories to sort of cover a full career in just his playing career. And I felt that was the one thing that was missing, especially because George himself said, "Remember me for my football." And so that's kind of the kind of ethos I was taking with it. You know, just talk about his football. You can't avoid everything because it would be negligent to pretend that some of the stuff didn't exist. But I have sort of addressed it in the context of a football career, which I don't think has been done this way before. I'm really proud of it. I mean, it's one for football lovers, this book. You know, it is really intensive to do with his football. And I've interviewed over 30 people for it, and they've all spoke, you know, with such passion about that football inside of him. So it's very, very minimal that he strays away from that.
Did you ever meet George?
No, I wasn't lucky enough to, but I've talked to his family at length to tell them what I was doing, you know, in a lot of contact quite often with Callum and with Ian, so his brother, and you know, his sisters as well. I've talked to a couple of them. So yeah, it's one of those unfortunate that I didn't. You know, I would have loved to have done, but you know, it just didn't happen.
Now, when you say George's playing career, George didn't just play for Manchester United, but he was largely recognised as being the greatest player on the planet whilst playing for Manchester United. You referenced Hibernian. He also played at Fulham. He also scored one of the greatest goals that we've ever seen when he played in America, didn't he, for San Jose Earthquakes against Fort Lauderdale, one of his former clubs, in July 1981. But, you know, George, I've heard many references of George and talked to many pals of mine that played with and against George, and George just had everything, didn't he? He was a beacon for everything, whether that was column inches in papers or Miss Worlds.
Yeah, no, he was. You're right to say that, and he was. It's funny that. He was the greatest in the world when he was at United, and everything else after that. Perhaps he himself saw it as an anticlimax, everything that happened after United. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's what he told Rodney Marsh at one point, you know, that he felt that it was an anticlimax. But if you talk to either the fans of the clubs that he went to at the time or the players that he played with, they'll remember it as the best time. Tony Gale, for example, Rodney Marsh, who were with him at Fulham, they just talk of that as those were the glory days of Fulham. You know, and they've had some great days since. They've played in finals, little Fulham, and yet they've never been entertained like they were when George was there. So, you know, it's important to look at it from those aspects. And you mentioned the goal against against Fort Lauderdale, and that goal was, I think it was the fourth last of his career.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So that's a player who's in decline, scoring the best goal that's been ever seen in the NASL. When people reference the NASL, that's the goal that people look at, isn't it? It's not Pele, it's not Cruyff. It's what a George Best in terminal decline apparently did right at the end of his career. So there were memories like that wherever he went. Obviously, some places, Stockport and the Jewish Guild and Bournemouth are too short of time to make an impact in terms of his playing, but it's still memorable for the time that he spent there because of the controversy that came up. But obviously, the clubs like you mentioned, Fulham, even Hibernian, they've still got really fond memories of what he did on the pitch as well. It wasn't a waste of anything after he left United, actually. You know, it's important that gets viewed in a different perspective, and that's what I've tried to do. I mean, there's a lot in there about those days. It's not just one for United fans.
Did you manage to get a word with Mike Summerby? Because they were great mates back in the 60s, weren't they? And used to holiday together. And Manchester City and Manchester United, they were both fantastic clubs vying for, I suppose, top dogs in Manchester, but also top in Europe as well. Manchester was the hub of football back in George's day, wasn't it?
Yeah. No, it was a difficult one for me to do that. I mean, Mike would have obviously been a good person to talk to.
Yeah.
But if you look at the number of books that have been written about George and the number of people that have spoke about him, a lot of people have written books basically based on their relationship with George. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I tried to sort of, if I was going to write a book of this sort of magnitude, this size, I was going to spend my time trolling for less covered ground.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think I'm not discounting Mike's value as someone who was so close to George, but there are a lot of people who were close to George that I didn't contact for that reason. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
They've got their own story and they'll tell their own story, and a lot of them have told their own story. I just wanted to I had a vision of what I wanted to do with the book, and sort of I cherry-picked a sort of short list of names, and thankfully, just about all of them I told to. So, you know, as much as it is great to hear Mike some of these stories of George, sometimes it's good to hear stories of Mike and George together. And, you know, that sort of, for example, Rodney Marsh, I talked to him for the book, and sort of getting the stories of what it was like to play with George at Fulham, but then Tony Gale, who talked to me, also talked about what it was like to play with Rodney and George. So that kind of balanced it out as well, added a little bit of depth to it. So I just wanted to bring something as different as possible to the table.
Absolutely, and they tackled each other, didn't they? I think, was it a game against Hereford? Through memory with George and Rodney. I mean, they were two of the greatest showmen that's graced a football pitch in this country, and of course, both of them played in the NASL. Alan Hudson, did Uddy contribute for this book?
I got a few words from him. Yeah, I did. Very happy to. I think. It was right at the back end of writing it, so I managed to squeeze a couple of stories in there from him. But there's one about the goal that I think he watched George's goal against Chelsea in a pub or something. There was a couple of stories in there. So yeah, that was a great thing about writing it, is that you had so many people keen to I had people who I didn't even put in the book who I just talked to, you know, just so they could talk to me about their experiences of knowing George. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And it was it's a weird experience because it was almost like, well, it is like that when you write a biography, that you feel like you know the person, but because people were so affectionate in the way that they spoke about him, it was like it was a good experience for me to write it in that respect.
How difficult was it in terms of you're writing a book about the greatest player on the planet at the time, George Best? Yeah. When you're writing a book of such magnitude about such a player, you just want to give it your absolute all and your best. And did you almost feel that when you're writing it, is this good enough as I'm writing it? I know it is, but was there any doubt in your mind while you're doing it? Because you want to do him absolute justice. As his name suggested, George was the best.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely right. I've got that fear now.
Yeah.
You know, it's booked out, yeah, and I've absolutely got that fear. It's one of those things. So I wrote the biography of Jimmy Murphy that was published in 2018, and Jimmy Murphy was the assistant to Matt Busby, and I've always been of the belief that Jimmy's the most important man in Manchester United history. I followed that with a book on Eric Cantona, who I believe is the most important player in Manchester United history. And then the natural progression after that was then to write a book on the best player in football history, who I believe is George. And yeah, from day one, right through to now, and possibly right into the future, is going to be a case of that doubt, because first of all, you get that with writing anything, but secondly, you're absolutely right that it's a book of such magnitude about such a player, and this is my shot at it. This is the time that I've taken to take that shot. It is a moment of sort of concern about that, but the thing is, I was obviously one of those things where I took care over everything. I do anyway, but a little bit of extra care in writing. I was very scrupulous with a lot of the sort of terminology that I was using in there. I was, careful to sort of set scenes and tell stories in there in a different way. Obviously being keen to make sure that I get as much feedback as possible from the start, from before it was finished and everything like that. I was very fortunate. I am very fortunate to know Paddy Barclay, as you mentioned earlier at the podcast that I do with him. Paddy for me is the best living sports writer, football writer. I absolutely love him. He's magnificent. So his opinion is something that I value massively, and he's been a big sort of supporter of my work in the past. And obviously, I sent him this, and I talked to him for the book as well. And he called me probably a couple of weeks ago. He gave a blurb for the book. So obviously he'd read the book a few months ago, and so he called me up to sort of give me the blurb. There's a cover quote for it, which is really generous. But then he called me again a couple of weeks ago. So this is some time passed, and he just literally called me to reassure me. He said, I've been reading through the George book again, and I honestly think it's your best work. Do you know what I mean? And so I feel confident, or reassured, I should say, in that regard, that it stands up. Do you know what I mean?
If Paddy Barclay says it's good, because you're right. That guy is an absolute legend as a football writer. I've listened to him an awful lot on TalkSport when he's been on TalkSport. Whenever Paddy's done anything, I've always listened to him. He's so intelligent. His voice is fantastic, and I can listen to Paddy for ages. He's a big Dundee fan, isn't he? He's from up there in Scotland, but he was he seemed. He must have a big allegiance with Man United, because I was listening to your podcast that you'd done on Munich, and it was phenomenal, the attention to detail, because of course Paddy wrote that book about Sir Matt. It's a book that I have in my library, and as I say, an absolute legend working with someone like that. But George was a clever lad as well. George could have written a book, but he didn't. What he said to me, I've seen George at his best and at his worst when he was playing, and some of the goals and some of the stuff that he'd done on the football pitch. And then sadly, when George was ill in hospital, Alan was one of the few people that was allowed to go and see George, and he said he's like a frightened, frail old man. And Alan said to George, you need to sit down and write the book. There's been loads of books written about you, but you need to write a book in your own words. Sadly, George never did that, but he passed his 11 plus, and he got turned down as a kid by Glentoran, didn't he, the team that he supported as a boy?
Yeah, it was too small, apparently, and there's the great story about Bob Bishop sending a telegram to Manchester saying, "I found you a genius." Mm-hmm. But even he had to be convinced that George wasn't too small. Do you know what I mean? So it just goes to show that talent can be missed, even by the great spotters. It's funny that you mentioned that he about George writing a book, because obviously he wrote that great autobiography, Blessed, which came out, and I actually discovered, because the name of the book is True Genius, and he actually the working title for his autobiography, Blessed, was actually Genius, right. And he rejected it because it sounded too braggadocious. So he didn't like the way that it sounded, and I always felt, obviously that's a measure of his modesty, but when you're writing about someone, you've got every right to sort of describe them as you like. Do you know what I mean? You can hail them as much as you want, and he definitely deserves that title. So I was keen to sort of give him that, even if he wasn't comfortable saying it about himself.
But you're absolutely right, because what he says to me, George was the most modest of persons, and Alan Hudson loves that in a person. He loves George's modesty. He said he was a shy guy as well, and a clever man. He'd always be sitting in the pubs doing the crossword, and they'd go and have a drink together. But he was a big fan of Wolverhampton Wanderers as well as a kid, because he loved Peter Broadbent, didn't he?
Yeah, it was the colour of the kit as well, because I think he saw that it was a gold kit, so he was a fan of that, and yeah, I think it was the idea that Wolves were playing. One of the first games that he saw of Wolves playing was in European football. Do you know what I mean? They were on the television in his neighbour's house, and I think it was the cosmopolitan side of the fact that they were playing European football. They were playing against the great teams in the world, and for someone who lived on an estate in Belfast, Manchester felt like it was a million miles away to, Wolverhampton felt like it was a million miles away to him. So when he got the chance to go over there, I think that sort of played into why he was such a liberated spirit. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. The fact that he was able to, that he felt free and that he was free, and it was no coincidence that sort of played into his playing personality as well.
Have you got any favourite game memories of George? Any favourite goals that he scored? Because he made his debut for United against West Bromwich Albion in 1963, age 17. The special one really come to our fore, didn't he?
Yeah, it's difficult because I think the beauty of a player like George is that everyone will have their favourite goal.
Sure.
When you write about it, like I have done, I've got really nice, like even reading back my own writing, I enjoy looking at some of the way some of the goals have been described. It's probably better to look at it from a different point of view and from that and sort of say how much joy do I get out of how other people described his goals.
Yep.
And the goal that he scored in the European Cup final in 1968, a couple of the players who played with him go on record as saying that's the most important goal in United history, which I really like that because it gives a real emphasis to the fact that it was really, and that you've got club legends speaking like that. But I think the favourite, one of my favourite descriptions of one of George's goals is the goal that he scored against Chelsea, the one where Harris tries to maim him, and he keeps his balance and then scores. Because Alex Stepney gave a great description about it in the book, and I won't spoil it too much, but it was kind of like he'd become so good. You see today's players, they go down so easily, and it's all about gamesmanship and sort of falling down and conning players and conning your opponent, conning the referee and winning penalties and everything like that. But George couldn't afford to do that because referees weren't as generous in those days. They weren't lenient. So George had to just find new ways to be better than his opponent. That's what that goal was. It was about George being so far ahead of his opponents and peers that he was fast enough to beat the tackle and beat the foul. And it's so difficult to comprehend because you don't see that from players today. But to be able to do that, to have the speed and the intelligence to do that, I think that's probably the biggest statement of the biggest compliment you can give him, really, because the imagination side of it, nobody could even come on a par with him. Some of the things he did, he scored from corners deliberately. Do you know what I mean? But
yeah.
we couldn't get inside George's head. He did that kind of thing, and it was for him to describe. And obviously, he didn't know how to do it because these were moments of magic. But the moments where you can actually watch the physical side of it, where you see how good he was and you see how quick he was, and that's just the mastery of the game that nobody in football, and I'm talking Ronaldo, Zidane, Messi, nobody has come close to that. The closest you've probably got is Ronaldo and, say, Maradona, who withheld the tackles. Do you know what I mean? They still got up after the tackles. But George was so good that he was quicker than the foul. And I think that's really what set him apart. And yeah, so that description of the Chelsea goal from Alex Stepney, it's got a really fond place in now that I've written this book and everything like that, and obviously I'd watched all of George's goals before I even started writing the book. So I say all of George's goals that are available to be seen. So actually going back over them again for the book and getting a different appreciation of them, I think that's where I am with that. Is that it's probably the Chelsea one that stands out for me.
It certainly is the standout goal from Alan Hudson. And Huddy says to me, Chopper to this day still thinks that George is going to go down. But George just had the greatest, probably the most balanced player that I've ever seen. And on them pitches, they were so heavy as well. I mean, to describe that challenge, it was almost an assault. And Chopper Harris tried to buckle George, but he just rode in, kept his balance, and he was just phenomenal. And the reference with Diego Maradona in the 86 World Cup finals scored a goal against Belgium where he should have fallen over when he'd scored that goal because he's reeled away and kept his balance because Maradona had that low sense of gravity and was fantastic in his balance and the way he played football. And George, when he scored that goal against Sheffield United, was very, very similar at Old Trafford. He kept his balance when you're thinking he's going to fall over here, but just had such tremendous balance.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think two of my favourite passages of my own writing in the book are that Sheffield United goal, and also the second goal that he scored against Benfica in '66. Because when you watch that one back, the Benfica one, he goes between two players, and you don't understand where the space has come for him to do that. It's like a bird dodging buildings. Do you know what I mean? It's just incredible to see someone of that slight figure glide that way. It's just incredible, really. And it is that balance, really, and that sort of the way that he was. It's particularly that Benfica goal, but the Sheffield United goal is a good example of it as well. That he was playing the game on he's almost like on half speed. Everyone else is like, you know what I mean? They're just so far behind him. They're just great examples of his incredible balance, his incredible speed of body and of thought.
Tony Waddington described football as the working man's ballet, and I don't think there's any greater exponent of that than George Best. It was like watching football and ballet. It was the working man's ballet. It was like poetry in motion. He was everything and more. And George will be talked about for generations to come. And strangely enough, George never ever played in a World Cup finals, where largely these players that play in big games, they're remembered for winning World Cups, winning major titles. George only done that in England and in Europe when they won the European Cup in '68. Just proves how fantastic George Best actually was.
Yeah, no, you're right. And there's going to be those kind of talks forever.
Yeah.
You know, Cruyff, Maradona, Pelé. It's essentially something that I have talked about in the book because you've got your own take. Everyone's got their own take on what defines greatness and what element of that is better. I mean, is it better that Maradona won the title with Napoli and then won the World Cup with Argentina? Is it better than that George was the star in a team that had two Ballon d'Or winners and won the European Cup. Do you know what I mean? Is it better that, at the age of 32 or 30, no, it might have just been 30 or 31 when Northern Ireland played against Holland, and he was that determined to nutmeg Cruyff that the first thing he did was get the ball and ran across the pitch to purposefully do it. He was the kind of player that really, like I said, the kind of player that there wasn't really another kind like him, but for him to sort of predict what he was going to do and then do it, you know what I mean, in a game that's so random as football, to be able to have that kind of manipulation over everything to make it go the way that he predicted it was going to go is a certain level. I mean, genius is the right word for it, because how can someone manipulate a game as random as football? But George did, and he often sort of predicted what he was going to do. It's just remarkable. It's that kind of character and that side of him that I don't really think is appreciated enough.
Absolutely. Didn't he want to take his boot off as well? Because George would do mad things like that in a game, wouldn't he? He'd take his boot off, come get the ball. I mean, he famously headed the ball out of Gordon Banks. Gordon Banks had thrown it up and George went and headed it, but that goal was disallowed, wasn't it? I don't know why, because it was a perfectly legal goal from George against England. Yeah,
he absolutely, that's right. And that was the kind of thing I'm talking about. He would plan that sort of thing, and you're absolutely right. There's an incident of him taking his foot off. He sort of goes to go past someone holding his boot in his hand. It's actually a famous story of Burnley 65 in the FA Cup. His left boot came off, and so if you imagine Old Trafford, February 1965, it would have been a mud heap. His left boot came off. He tried to run down the wing, but he, obviously holding the boot was a pain for him, so he threw the boot into the stand, and the fans threw the boot back at him, and he actually carried on running. He got the ball. He got his boot, but he carried on running with this. He's only got one foot. He'd been over. This is exactly as it happened, and it's incredible that this story's not really been told that often, but I've got it for the book. He'd been over it in his crosses all afternoon, and because his boot wasn't on his foot, and it was his left foot, he didn't generate enough power on the cross this time, but it was the perfect weight on the cross. Dennis Lowe scored an overhead kick from that. From kickoff, Burnley tried to go down to score again because they saw that George still hadn't got his boot on, and the referee shouldn't have actually kicked the game off for the restart because George didn't have his boot on. And then United cleared it and attacked. George still only had one boot on and set up a goal for Clarence. This is like twice within the last 10 minutes, and like within the space of 3 minutes that he did that. He actually saw the game out only wearing one boot, so he's played 7 or 8 minutes without a boot on. And at the end, they were complaining, everyone was complaining that the referee shouldn't have allowed it because George wasn't wearing boots. So even when he wasn't wearing boots, they were complaining that it was too good and they wanted the goal allowed. Unbelievable. But that's just an example of the sort of unbelievable stories that you hear about George.
Everything that you hear about George is feasible. Even if somebody actually said, do you know what? George Best was from another planet and they dropped him off and forgot to come back for him, I would say, do you know what? I actually believe that because he was an out-of-this-world talent. When's the book coming out? How can people purchase the book and how can they pre-order it now?
Okay, so they've got a few opportunities. The best place to get it in the UK is obviously Amazon. They're doing a pre-order price of I think it's just under £15.
Yep.
That's April the 8th it comes out. But the publisher, Reach Sport, are doing a worldwide offer. So the RRP on the book is £20, but they're doing a pre-order offer of £15, and the shipping around the world is quite reasonable. Obviously at the moment you've got Brexit which has changed all the sort of shipping regulations. So if anyone's listening outside the UK, and I list like the European listeners or even Irish listeners in that, get on to Reach Sport because they've got really good shipping options at the moment to get the book for as cheap as you're going to get it. And I don't know, I think because at the moment the pre-order price is, £15. It's such a big book. I don't know how long the price will be that cheap. So get on that while you can. Thank you.
And how can people engage with you through your social media as well, Wayne? Because I'm sure people, fans, lovers of football, no matter what football club you support or you've got your allegiance to, everybody knows George Best, and I'm sure that they will want to purchase this book from you and link up with you and just say, Wayne, what a great job you've done in writing that book about George.
If they want to tell me that, then that's fine. They can do that. My social medias on Twitter and Instagram, it's Wayne S. Barton.
Yep.
So obviously, if you've got something nice to say about it, please do. But if you don't have something nice to say about it, then I'm afraid I'm not on social media.
Just say Gabbie, Cabbie.
yeah.
And finally, what's next? You've written some magnificent books. You're doing podcasts with Paddy. So let's have a shout out how fans can engage with your podcast with the great Paddy Barclay and your next project, if you've got one on the back burner at the moment.
Yeah, the stuff with Paddy, we've got a Patreon podcast at the moment, but all the United History podcast, we did a series for radio last year, and all that's available on Apple Podcasts, possibly on Spotify as well.
Yeah.
That's just Barclay and Barton on Manchester United. We did a full series in lockdown on the Premier League. Every season of the Premier League was covered. So that's just Barclay and Barton on the Premier League. We've thrown aside my United bias for that one. Paddy's thrown me under the bus a few times about the years where we didn't win anything. So yeah, there's that stuff. At the moment, I'm actually working on a book about Wayne Rooney.
Okay.
So obviously with his retirement at the moment, I had a folder of thousands of news clippings about Rooney's career because I was going to get around to it one day, and it just so happened that one day he's here because he's retired, and there's no better time to sort of do a full book on his full career. So that's something I'm working on at the moment. I do have a couple of things. There's by the time that this comes out, there's going to be news about different things that are coming out at the same time that I can't sort of mention until someone else mentions it.
Yep.
And then a book with just about finished that's coming out in August is with Fabio and Rafael da Silva.
Yeah, I've seen that.
The twins, Sunshine Kids.
Yep.
That has been an incredible thing to work on, and it's going to be so different to what people might expect. And finally, if I've not plugged enough, there's one for people who aren't United fans. I did a few years ago now, I did a biography. I worked with Gordon Jago, who was the former QPR and Millwall manager. But that was released in the US, and that's being released in the UK in August as well. So for the first time, so QPR and Millwall fans, probably when their glory years, Gordon was the manager there. So that will be coming out as well. So there's plenty of stuff. I just hope that it's not oversaturating the market too much. But the George one's coming out first. So yeah. I
absolutely love talking to people about their work. I love listening to their work on the either Apple Play or Spotify. I'm an absolute podcast nut. That there are some fantastic journalists, podcasters out there, and it's all about promoting, giving a shout out to different people, different groups, different, so people can engage with them and listen to their work, because that's what I do. And I educate myself by listening to people like you on your casts and reading your books. So can I thank you very much for your time, sir, and thank you to all the podcasters out there and all the writers, all the bloggers and all the journalists that I get so much pleasure in either interviewing, reading or listening to.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, and I echo your thank you as well. I mean, having stuff to entertain us is what's got us through a difficult year, isn't it? So I'm no different to yourself, apart from working. That's the thing that I've been doing, listening and reading to stuff. So it's massive thank you to all those people who sort of took the time to do that. It's just an incredible gift to give someone, isn't it? Sort of curing the boredom, entertainment is great.
I think so, because, when we do watch football these days, I'm going to let you go because United are playing in Europe tonight against AC Milan, and good luck to them. Without people writing books about players of yesteryear, sadly, some of those memories in time just dissipate and vanish, because all you do here on radio these days is Premier League, Premier League, Premier League, and football didn't just start in 1992. Football started in the 1800s, and I think it's fantastic that we can reference and look and read and about our great players, because without the history, we have no now and we have no future. So well done, mate.
Yeah, thank you. No, you're right. I agree. Absolutely agree.
Top man. Till next time. Cheers, mate. All the best, and thank you so much.
Thank you, mate. Thank you.
Cheers, pal. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. And thanks for listening, guys.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Did you know cats tend to hide symptoms of sickness and pain? I learned this the hard way after losing my cat, Gingy. So I created Pretty Litter, a health monitoring litter that helps detect early signs of illness by changing colors, saving you money and potentially your cat's life. Pretty Litter is veterinarian developed, and it's the easiest way to keep tabs on your fur baby's health right at home.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.